This is Michael Fisher for savingandinvesting.com, and I want to talk about fiscal policy briefly. The fiscal policy of a government relates to its budget and the amount of spending that it does and the amount of revenues that it receives through taxation. So governments each year prepare a budget, and that budget encompasses areas in which they'll spend, whether that's on education, schooling, care for the elderly, public highway projects, and other areas, government services, and so forth. It also, on the other side, on the revenue side, looks at taxation, income taxes, and other taxes that the government then receives. And overall, that relates to the fiscal budget of a government and how it spends and receives revenues. Now, the fiscal policy is very important because to some extent it can influence growth in the economy, it can influence how much money there is in circulation, although monetary policy has as its primary target, that is the ultimate effectively target setting mechanism for inflation. But the fiscal policy is very important because it can be used to expand and to grow an economy or to contract an economy. And governments often run what's known as a budget deficit, i.e. they're spending more than they're taking in, and often typically they fund this by selling bonds into the market. So investors either within a country or investors abroad are buying bonds, in other words lending money to that government while it is spending more than it's receiving in tax revenue. And so we often talk about the budget deficit or the budget or the overall debt that's been accrued of a government, and that relates to the amount of spending that that government has done versus its revenues. And that overall is the topic of the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, one of the main elements of economic policy overall, and it relates to government spending and government revenues through taxation. Now, governments can in the short term spend more than they take in and fund the difference through bond sales, and that's very often the case. And particularly that's the case during periods where the government is trying to stimulate the economy. So when an economy is going to a downturn, for example, governments may make a greater effort to stimulate it by increasing their spending in order to create jobs and to create economic growth, while at the same time potentially not funding all of this spending through taxation, because they don't want to decrease the amount of spending that individuals can do and companies can do in that same period, thereby leaving them with more money to also spend and re-stimulate the economy. And that difference is funded through the government bond markets, and governments then issue bonds into the market and thereby borrowing money to fund this deficit and this budget shortfall. Now, governments often spend more than they take in for long periods of time, and that's one of the reasons that certain economies have very large debts. And ultimately these debts have to be bought by investors, and ultimately some of this government debt becomes mature and has to be repaid. So the government is always analyzing how much it should be spending, what it's going to take in, and what its fiscal policy should be in order to stimulate growth, to have a healthy growing economy, to create jobs, while at the same time ideally not having to rely too much on borrowing and borrowing from investors who may or may not have an appetite for the government debt or may require higher rates of return at certain points in time, and also ultimately will require repayment when that debt becomes mature.